This is episode 2 of a series of episodes that we're putting out with DeWayne Fliss, who is the founder of Concord Consulting. We're going to be focusing in the second episode on traits. So in the first episode, go back and listen to that. There's tons of information, kind of a foundation for what led to this tool being used and how it's put together in some ways, and Dwayne's experiences. Episode 2 is going to focus on one tool that Concord Consulting offers, a very specific tool. It's something that has made a significant difference in my own life, so there's a lot of buy-in from me as well. But I'm going to be interviewing Dwayne and really specifically getting into traits as a tool. What is it? What is going on with that? And that's the question I'll start off with here, Dwayne, is what is traits?
Let's talk about psychometrics for a moment, because it's sort of the basis of understanding traits as we measure them and as other instruments measure them. So psychometrics is the field of mental measurement, psychomental metrics measurement, so the field of mental measurement. In the field of behavioral sciences, it's fairly new. So probably about 1950s is when the first psychometric instruments started to show up from a commercial perspective, where they were on the marketplace, available for consumption. But the first psychometric instrument that was developed was actually developed by the American military prior to the beginning of, or at the announcement of their engagement in World War II. And most people don't know this story, but it's interesting, because if you think about a country that just declared war on 2 continents, Pacific and Europe, and they have to mobilize millions of people to, in the next 3-4 weeks or 2-3 months at the most, be ready for war, put their life on the line in many cases, they had to figure out some way to sort through all of those people and decide, are you going to fly an airplane? Are you going to drive a tank? Are you going to shoot a gun? Are you going to fly a ship? Are you going to drive a ship? And so they created, the American military created this instrument, a paper and pencil instrument, to measure people's intelligence. And they thought, their theory was, people who have a higher level of intelligence should be able to learn things faster. If they can learn things faster, then we can take somebody who was a farmer or a mechanic or an engineer and teach them how to fly a plane or drive a ship. And so that was their theory. There was no evidence, no data to prove any of that, but that was their theory. And so all of the people that signed up for military service, millions of people prior to World War II, they passed them through this paper and pencil. They called it an intelligent quotient inventory. Today, you and I call it an IQ test.
Is this the test that Elvis would have failed?
Yes, probably.
Okay. In the 70s or whenever that was.
Yes, it could have been that one. They had additional ones at that point. So,
okay.
But no, I know he may not have failed that one, but there may have been some other ones.
Okay.
Aptitude ones, probably. So that was the genesis of psychometrics. It was basically military based. It was in the face of war. It was in the face of trying to get the right person and the right thing. Now, because you were intelligent, didn't necessarily mean you would be a good pilot. There were other kinds of things that were important, obviously, for that. So that's how they sort of sorted through people and tried to say, okay, you move over there into the pilot line, you move over there into the Navy line or driving the ship line, etc. Once that was established and worked, and to some extent you could say the U.S. was responsible for winning both of those wars, so there was some value in that assessment and that placement process that came out of that. That then precipitated a whole bunch more study and research and development in this area of understanding humans in a more comprehensive way. So today we have things like aptitude surveys, aptitude measurements, your mechanical versus your musical versus your artistic, etc. And now those are used in the academic environment quite a bit to help people try to figure out what kind of a study should you take and what are you naturally inclined to do? What's easy for you? What do you have a natural, ability about or high ability about? And then this whole idea of understanding personality became another area, and that is quite varied and in different ways and different levels and for different purposes. But that's how the field of psychometrics came about. And so it was a it became more academically focused, where there was actually like schools that taught psychometrics, and it was always at a graduate level, by the way. It's never been at an undergraduate level. So you have to have some basics in order for you to kind of move into this graduate level study. So the field evolved very, very slowly, because the only people hiring anybody who had some advanced psychometric education were, for the most part, governmental or research focused, right? So private enterprise hadn't yet figured out how this should work, or what we could do with these people, or how they could help us in some kind of a fashion. So there was this gap between understanding, a human more completely and more clearly, versus the kind of place that could fit into the world. And most of the working population works outside of government, not inside of government.
I think about a lot of psychometric assessments that I've used in the past. They're famous ones. I'm not going to call them out here. The problem that I've always had with them, DeWayne, is that they feel like they're putting me in a box. I feel like I've got one of 4 choices. Maybe if it's really complex, one of 16 choices, but that it's always placing me in a box. That they also, I've always been, so I always did some graduate work in psychology as well. And when I was going through that, I was not enamored with the idea of, I tell you who I am, and then the results say, this is who you are. And I think, well, I just told you who I am. Like, what's the big deal here? Do you know what I mean? Sorry, you were talking about the history of the psychometric assessments and testing.
Yeah. So that genesis of it, and a wartime thing through to what happened after the war, and then it's showing up in academic kind of places. And it started off in the northeastern United States. Those were the first universities that started to do some kind of formal training around it, and find profs who actually had the ability to be able to do research there, and then build curriculum around that. And then it eventually expanded. But it's of all of the people working in the world, psychometricians are the least amount. There's just very few jobs for them in the world. Yep. So if you're not working for a government enterprise doing something in the educational space with different student bodies and levels and places and all of that kind of a stuff, there's just very little work for you to do. So I was introduced to traits through my graduate study. That's where I became exposed to it, and understanding the difference between traits and behaviors. And I didn't really understand that. But there are a huge amount of behaviors in the world, but not many traits. And so when people are describing other people, they use lots of behavioral language to describe them. But some of those behavioral descriptions don't show up in traits. They're not a part of traits. For instance, anger. Is anger a trait? No, but it's a behavior. And it can show up or it can't show up. And different things will precipitate people being angry, but it doesn't show up on a trait scale any place. So we see anger, we feel anger, we express anger, but it's not a trait. So it's kind of understanding what is it that all human beings have that's common to them. And not all human beings have anger, by the way, or if they do, it could be very, very different in terms of how it's expressed, either inwardly or only outwardly, or only loudly or only quietly, or only privately for that matter. So it's trying to distinguish between what are the traits that are most useful for the working population, not for psychological assessment, but for the working population. And there's a limited amount of them. And so as I studied traits and started to realize the difference between those two things, I decided that what's most important is to understand a person's traits. And even though it's not going to give you an entire picture of that person, no instrument does, by the way, it gives you a very clear picture of how they're going to show up and do work every day, work at any level, in any kind of an industry, in any kind of a location in the world. So
on a consistent basis, right?
On a consistent, predictable basis.
Yes. So we're seeing, we know the traits, we can now predict the behaviors, generally speaking, consistently.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the idea of traits, excuse me, the idea of traits manifested itself in my head as being something that was more important than just behaviors by themselves. Now, traits have to show up behaviorally. We have to be able to see some evidence of how they walk and talk and behave every day. But the manifestation of traits and understanding them and then finding ways to decode them in a person became to me the kind of priority and the most value in the marketplace. Not to replace or displace psychological assessment, because there's a lot of value in that, but it's a way more comprehensive process and has more objectives to it than just a traits assessment would have. So traits to me became the most important thing. And then in psychometrics, you learn about constructs. So a construct is a linear, cohesive line of behaviors. And so the idea of a construct is, if you think about assertiveness as a behavior, is there a low level of assertiveness? Yes. Some people with very little assertiveness. Is there people who have an average degree of assertiveness? Yes. There's some people who have that. Or there's some people who have an above average degree? Yes. There's some people who have an extreme degree? Yes, there's that. So that's a construct. All of those behaviors show up on the same scale in different kinds of degrees. And so the idea is building a construct of something that you think is going to be equally measured across a population and within a human being, right? So every instrument designer has to decide on what they think are the important constructs. So when I was creating our traits tool, I thought these 7 constructs were the most important ones for work-related kind of decisions. There are other constructs that you can build for measuring traits in humans, but I didn't think they were going to be useful for the workplace. And so I focused on these 7 constructs. And when I designed the instrument for our construction company, I used 4.
Okay.
Because it was easier to do, and they were the 4 most important ones for what we were doing at that point. And so when I started this one for Concord, we expanded that, used the same 4, and then we expanded it to 7, because I thought that was going to be way more valuable for employers and also for employees, or for individuals who are just going through this in terms of understanding themselves.
Now, backing up a little bit, the idea of personality, I consistently run into, it seems like a pretty pervasive idea. And you talked about this in the first episode of how there's such a self-help mindset to our culture right now. We can be whoever we want to be, and anyone can change, anyone can develop. By definition, my understanding of personality is those traits which tend not to change over time in a person, or if they do change, they change very slowly. They are very, what's the right word? They're resistant to change over a period of time. Would you agree with that? What would you tweak in that?
Yeah. So the description that I like to use for traits is enduring characteristics that remain consistent regardless of circumstances, regardless of time. So human beings have 2 kinds of traits. We have physical traits, so the color of your eyes. If you have brown eyes when you're 20, you're going to have brown eyes when you're 30, 40, 50, 60. So it's an enduring characteristic. Yep. And we have personality traits. So if you're like you, assertive, and you're assertive at 20, you're going to be assertive at 30, 40, 50, 60. It may show up at 50 or 60 differently than it does at 20, but it will always be there. That degree of assertiveness will always be there. So behaviors are what you say and what you do and how you say it and how you do it. So behaviors are very much your response to a circumstance, a situation, a person, a problem, a scenario of some kind. So I can cause you to change your behaviors. You can cause me to change my behaviors. You're a parent. I'm a parent. We try to change behaviors of our children from time to time, somewhat successfully or not. And so we're always trying to change behaviors. Every day, all of us are trying to change somebody's behavior, or somebody's trying to change our behaviors. And we live with that very effectively, very comfortably in our society and in our workplace and in our intimate relationships, our important relationships. But I can't change your traits any more than I can change the color of your eyes. And you can't change my traits any more than you can change the color of my eyes. So I decided that what I wanted to do was build an instrument that measured those things that can't be changed, and then measure the behaviors in terms of how that person sees an instant in time, a point in time. because that could be useful for us, but we're not going to make a decision, an important decision about that. We really want to make a decision about a person's traits. So that's how we evolved our instrument into building the constructs, the scales, the comprehensiveness of them, and the things that they measure and how that's important and why that's important in workplace, any job, any level, in any kind of a location.
I'm going to go back to something that we talked about a little bit. I talked about how I was not very enamored with a lot of psychometric assessments in the past. And you talked about the original IQ test and how it was really a very blunt tool, which makes sense as these things evolve, they become more complex and far better. But my understanding is that IQ tests aren't really even used in that format at all any longer because there are so many other factors involved. Having said that, what I really appreciate for myself with traits is that when I went through the assessment myself, it didn't put me into a box. I didn't feel it put me into a box. It wasn't I'm red or blue or a Saint Bernard or a dolphin or pink or green. There was almost this mosaic that it painted. Far more complex. Yes, there are still dots on this graph, but based on the constructs that you mentioned and the continuum of that construct, where I was in comparison with the population, the general population, I felt that it encompassed who I was in a far more, I'm not sure what the right word is, DeWayne. It encompassed who I am in a unique way. Rather than putting me into a box, it allowed for me to be who I am. Does that make any sense? And what is the feedback that you get from other people when they take this assessment?
Yeah. Most people are surprised at how well it captures them and describes them. And the reason for that is because if you say to someone, tell me about yourself, tell me about your personality, that's going to be a very short conversation, even with someone with a very high IQ and a great deal of education. When you say to them, tell me about yourself, tell me about your personality, they will have very few words to actually describe that. And to some extent, it's not because they may not know about themselves. They don't have a vocabulary that organizes who they are in a fashion that enables it to be understood by other people and also be clear and distinctive about how it is that they are as a human being. So it's kind of like, I think I know who I am, but then when I read who I am, oh, that's who I really am. That captures me very, very well. I could not say all of those things, but when I read all those things, that's me, right? I agree with that. Well, that's the difference between traits and behaviors. So behavioral assessments, of which there are many, in fact, most of the instruments in the marketplace today measure what I would call behaviors first. And some of them measure traits, but most measure behaviors. So that if you have scales that measure behaviors and you're having a good hair day when you do that assessment, you're going to probably get some set of feedback that, reflects a good hair day. And then if someone asks you 2 months later to do that same assessment and it's a bad hair day for you for whatever reason, you're going to see that there's quite different results. And so now which one is me? Who am I? Because everybody has good hair days and bad hair days, but I don't know which one of these I am. And so we try to parse through that and say, tell us about your traits. Tell us about, how you do assertiveness and how you do sociability, and give you lots of choices for how you describe yourself using a 5-point scale, and then use some fairly sophisticated algorithms to parse through that and kind of say, here's where you are based on your collective responses to these different constructs. So I think the interesting and important thing about traits, besides the fact that they're enduring, is what they do. So what traits do in human beings is they drive your thinking. And that's what's really important and powerful about traits, besides being enduring. And so I'm going to be assertive at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 all my life, even though I may express it differently as time goes on, but I will not be less or more assertive. I might be wiser in how I demonstrate it or less wise in how I demonstrate it, but I will always be assertive in some fashion. But traits drive your thinking. So as an assertive person, you're thinking about, okay, how can I get this done? Why aren't you getting your job done? We should be doing this. I think this is our priority. And that's just your thinking process. And your mind and your brain doesn't go to a box called assertive and say, okay, I'm going to click that box and all the things that I should be doing that assertive today will come out of that box. That's not how our human mind works. So it's complex and it's multifaceted. But what it does, though, is that once you understand a person's traits, you start to understand their thinking. And when you understand their thinking, you realize that that pattern is going to continually repeat itself as my employee or as my boss or as my peer. And so now I can start to imagine what's going to happen when this event happens or that event happens or this lack of performance happens or this extra performance occurs. So it becomes more clear for you, not entirely predictable. No one can be that, but you get very clear pictures of how someone's going to do something. And now you can start to say, well, if I put them into that job, will most of their thinking processes do those activities in that job description? You would say probably 90 or 95% of them every day easily. Good enough, let's put them into that. We don't need 100%. Yep. And so that now enables an organization and a person to say, I can do that. That's easy for me to do, and I can be effective at doing that.
I appreciate how you've worded that, because so much of the time, the way I think about this is that traits lead to our behaviors, which is accurate, but you're including a really crucial step in there, is that traits can tell us how we think. And yes, how we think does determine how we will behave in different situations. But I think about very specific examples. So again, my kids can behave differently in different situations. My employees can behave differently in different situations. But what I can see from them consistently is that certain things will show up. I am not a detail-oriented person in any way, shape, or form. And I find that my admin assistant, I have to give her all of the detailed work. Because if I take on the detailed work, it will suffer, period. I need to, when I write a quick email to the tenants or whatever that I'm doing, I need to run it by her, because she will find the details that I've missed. She is wired detailed. And when it comes to thinking, I guess where I'm coming to with this is that my admin assistant, because I know how she thinks, I now communicate with her in a very different way. If I just give her a broad explanation of what I want, that does not work for her. Mm-hmm. That works for me. It does not work for her. Yeah. And I need to be self-aware enough to say, this is how I'm going to tend to communicate. How do I tweak this to help my admin assistant with what she needs to do? And she needs more specific instruction. If I give her a list, these are things that I want in this order, she is happy and she does work so well. When I give her a broad idea of just say, get this done, that does not work for her at all. Because if she has so many questions, coming back to thinking, she has so many questions that come up in her head that cannot be answered with the general description I've given. Is that a fair statement? Where would you go with that, or fill it in?
Yeah, so I would say that what you just described is the end result of what we would like to see people who are managers and leaders in their organization understand. Understand about the people who work for them, understand about themselves, and see that because they can't be the generalist and pick up from your 1,000-foot description of what it is they need to do, and they're saying, I need the 6-foot description. It helps you to say, okay, that doesn't mean that they're dumb. It just means that they think differently than I do. So I need to make sure for them to be effective that I'm giving them the kind of and quantity of information they need so that they can go away and do at a masterful level what they do that I know that I can't do. Mm-hmm. So the one thing about traits that is really hard for people to understand, I've learned, is to observe it and to see it and to recognize it when they see it. So it's really, to me, that's very, very interesting, because remember, I've been carrying this body of knowledge around with me for like decades now, and so when I see people struggling with this, I try to remember how I struggled with it and why that wasn't so clear or so obvious to me. So when I do training seminars where I'm trying to help our clients understand traits, and we're unpacking this and we're getting into deep detail, and we're talking about them and the people on the wall that work in their organization as illustrations to make sure that when you see that kind of detail or you see that kind of sociability in that person, and you read in our manual and in our reports, do you see that with that person? Is that clear for you in that person? So we do that for a day. And at the end of that day, I ask everybody in the room, all of whom I've met, some for the first time. I said, so, okay, you've been listening to me for, 7 or 8 hours now. Where do you think I am on the detail scale? So do you think I'm low? Do you think I'm average? Do you think I'm above average on detail? Where would you say I am based on, what you've observed with me today? And my profile's not on the wall, so they have to kind of figure it out based on their eyes and ears.
Guess this first time, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then while they're pausing and thinking, because there's no graph on the wall, I throw these little tidbits out there. I say, well, I'm an engineer, Oh, yeah, right, okay. And I studied psychometrics and organizational psychology. Oh, yeah, right. And you created this? Yeah, I created this. You must be high in detail, above average in detail.
Mm-hmm.
So most people, like I'm going to say 98 to 99% of the time, would say I'm above average and high in detail, and I'm -3 on that scale. Mm-hmm. So when I tell them that I'm -3, there's this kind of, well, that must be wrong, kind of response to it, right? And I said, why? And they said, well, how did you get through the academic? How did you create how did you figure out constructs, kind of? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I have an academic ability to do those things, so that was really, really important and necessary for me to do it. Number one, but number two, I have a large body of knowledge of this because I've been doing it for a long time. Mm-hmm. So what your eyes and ears are seeing is a large body of knowledge, and you can't distinguish between that and detail orientation. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm asking you this question now, for you to understand how hard it is to figure that out in another person. You've been listening to me for 7 hours or 8 hours a day, and you got it all wrong. Mm-hmm. So just understand how important that is, right? This is the 4th trait down. We have 3 more below this. Mm-hmm. And so you need to understand that this is not easy for human beings because your eyes and your ears are measuring all kinds of things. And in my case, it's measuring a large body of knowledge. And you think that that's high detail, and it's not. It's a large body of knowledge. And there's a big difference between those two things.
Which is why it's so tricky to look at behavior and somehow intuit who somebody is based on that. Again, book yes. by cover, that kind of stuff comes up. And I think about myself and how I have acted if my grandfather's just passed away, or something else has just happened in my life significant. I will behave differently for a period of time. What you're talking about is there are other aspects there too. If somebody has a large body of knowledge, they can dip into that body of knowledge. I've often heard that people who think they're very creative, if you look at people who are super creative, not in the traits, not by the traits definition here, I'm talking about just general public, what somebody thinks is creative, that often it's people who have done it for a long time and seen a lot of different situations. And so they're able to pull from a really unique tool chest because they've been able to learn how to use so many more tools. And so they can use a saw for this and a hammer for this. And that looks like creativity in the moment. But really, it's that wide body of knowledge that they have at their disposal.
Mm-hmm. Experience, yeah.
Yeah.
Experience and skills, kind of, yeah.
Let me ask you another question. So we've talked about this a little bit, how traits is different than a lot of other tools. A lot of other tools measure behavior, whereas traits is measuring the traits that determine behavior long-term on a consistent basis. Why should we trust the results? I just heard you say this was based on, of course, you had a background in academia, but really you were building this as you went along, right? And that's the question that I always ask myself is, how can I trust this? I've got a bit of academia in me too, so I'm always asking, how can we verify results? How are we thinking about that? And I'm not necessarily asking you to give an academic answer, but why should the average company say, yeah, that we're going to trust the results on a consistent basis that are being spat out of this machine that we put inputs into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not an easy question to answer without getting into
fair enough.
A fair amount of technical validity kind of studies and data and around it. So the development of a construct is kind of the most important scientific activity that you have to go through as you build an instrument. And so in our case, we have 7 constructs. And so we have to have 7 pieces of research. And you build that construct of, from timid to Attila the Hun on the assertiveness scale. And you test it with a large group of people. And you find out how many people describe themselves according to that scale, but just by itself. And then you have them do another establish instrument. That is, in our case, we used 16PF, which is in my mind, one of the best instruments in the marketplace today. So we have them do what we call a cross correlation. So do it on that one and do it on our construct. And then we compare the results to see how close we are between our assessment of that person based on their responses and 16PF's assessment based on their responses.
Which is a proven tool.
Established tool, yeah. And so you do that mechanically and methodically, and you do it over a period of time. It took a couple of years to build the constructs. This is not a fast process. You try to vary your audience so you have a good reflection of the population, both in age and in different kind of roles, different kind of industries, different kind of cultures, to make sure you have some reflection of what it is that's happening within your society. And then you have to do that for the various countries that you're in. So Australia, for instance, or the Spanish population in the United States, or the French population in Canada. So you have to build these different constructs to measure those populations and identify what we call norms. What's the norms within those populations? So it's quite a statistical, studied, longitudinal process to do that. And then periodically, we have to go through and make updates in the norms of our instrument, because as time goes on, population norms change, and you can't predict behaviors. You can only measure it historically. Yeah. That's where the evidence comes in, from the historical measurement of it.
And language changes as well, right? I mean, yes. There are updates to language and what language means. I play with this with my kids all the time. One word can mean a very different thing 100 years ago than it does now, or even 20 years, 15 years ago than it does now.
Yeah. I think one of the, so there is what we call psychometric validity, which has a variety of components and dimensions to it. And then there's face validity. So face validity is, when I read this about me, based on how I responded to the traits, is that my face? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And then I show it to somebody else and say, is that my face? And that person reads it and says, that's your face, that's you. I agree with that. There's nothing in there I would disagree with. Yeah. And so over a period of time, as we developed our reports, the content of our reports, the chapters in our reports, we would give them to a variety of people, and we would say, just cross out a word or a phrase or a bullet that you think is not capturing you. And we went from 1 or 2 per page to nothing per page. Yeah. And we realized that our descriptors were actually very accurately capturing these people by their measurement and by people who know them very well in their life as well. So that face validity is just as important as the statistical validity in doing these kinds of assessments and building these kind of assessments.
The reason I ask some of these questions is that I've asked them in the past myself, and I've been fascinated with the answers that I got and how there is a lot of validity. This is not a new tool. It's been around for 30 years. You've been longer than that, as you were developing it with construction business. But maybe jump into, what are the various applications? I shared my story of working with my admin assistant. You talked about that's kind of the end goal that you want to help other organizations with, or managers. What are the various, or maybe I'm going to change my question here. What are the most useful applications of this tool, from your perspective, for any organization? How do they get the best bang for their buck with this?
Yes. Yeah. Good question. Really important question around any kind of a psychometric assessment and instrument. So let me go back to Dr. Lawrence Peters. So he was my thesis partner. And so he and I collaborated on me doing some research to build my thesis. And my thesis was this: a job has a personality. So I did this many decades ago. And I came to that thesis because as I did that research and had all of those interviews with people about why do you stay and why did you leave, and understanding the importance of managers and management behavior, and understanding that the reason that most often the reason why people left is because that incompetency that Dr. Peter had described was actually manifesting itself in that person's manager, and they could no longer bear that incompetency, and they decided, I'm not going to change that person, so I need to go someplace else. So I thought at the end of all of that that what I needed to do is to get clear in my mind and to prove something that I had a sense of from my research work, that a job has a personality, and we need to figure that out, because the jobs where the people stayed for a long time, they stayed because of what their boss did or didn't do, said or didn't say, right? So that's so personality driven. Entire experience and skills, yes, but highly personality driven. So I realized there's something there that I need to uncover more and get more clear about. So that was my thesis. So
sorry, I'm going to interrupt for just for a second. Give me a really specific example, practical example of how a job has a personality.
So, for instance, if you have a sales job where you have to go out into the marketplace and deal with prospects or customers every day, and your performance is based on the amount of sales that you make and your ability to continue to do that and to continue to expand that as time goes on. So in order to do that job, regardless of what the product or service or combination of those are that your company represents, you have to be persuasive. And so where does persuasiveness come from? Does that come from knowledge? Does that come from education? Does that come from experience? Where does that come from? And the primary root of persuasiveness is within your personality. It's your nature to listen to someone, try to understand what it is that they are missing in terms of what you're providing or what you can provide, or your product or your service. See that gap and see that connect, and then find ways to take your product and service and help them to see how that gap can be solved or fixed, even if it's that powerful a solution for them. So persuasiveness. So it's got lots of components to it. It's detecting a gap, first of all, if we're talking about sales now, right? So it's detecting a gap between what that person, what that client or prospect is getting and not getting, or having and not having, and then trying to figure out in your mind, how do I see my product or my service filling that gap or fitting that gap for them? And then what are the words I use to actually make that clear and valuable to them? That's called persuasiveness. The root of all of that kind of comes from your characteristics, people who are higher on assertiveness and higher on sociability. So those people have a natural persuasiveness inside them, and they do it with everything they do. They're not just doing it for that particular job activity that they have 8 hours a day. They do it in the evening, in the morning, on the weekends, and on vacation. They're always trying to be persuasive in some fashion or another with somebody about something. And they don't have to wake up in the morning and read on a yellow sticky on their mirror, "Be persuasive today." It's just a part of their DNA. And so they naturally perform quite effectively in a sales role. So and there's a good illustration of that job, and there's all kinds of combinations of those that would show up in the world.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great example. And again, we see this in many different roles. I'm almost tempted to get into job descriptions. We're not going to talk about job descriptions right now. I want to leave that for a little bit later. But again, coming back to traits, you've talked about 7 different constructs. Maybe just describe, in just really quick summary, what are those 7 constructs, and what is the value of having each one of those in this tool?
Yeah. Most instruments in the marketplace today measure 4, or maybe 5, and those are the core ones that have been around for a long time in the marketplace, well established in some cases, 40 and almost 50 years old in terms of them, being available for commercial use in the marketplace. So assertiveness is common in almost every instrument. Sociability is common in almost every instrument. Some instruments may call it the introversion extroversion scale, but it measures the degree of sociability. What need do you have to have relationships with other people, which is kind of the construct itself. pace or patience is kind of a standard degree of a standard characteristic in every human being. What degree of patience do you have? What degree of impatience, or some combination of those do you have? And then structure, detail orientation, my need for structure and carefulness and thoroughness, or being more big picture versus hands-on in how I do things. So those four constructs are really critical to understand for every job in the world. Every job has some degree of assertiveness that's necessary. If you're a receptionist that is meeting and greeting people that come into your office every day or that leave your office every day, and your job is to ask for their name and their company, and your job is to phone someone and say, Mark is here to see you, and Mark is from this company, and then making sure you get there, and then making sure you get back and give your little sign-in card to them before you leave the building. Do we need that job to be assertive? Probably not. In fact, what would we do if we hired somebody that was assertive and you came in and they'd say, "What are you here for?" Oh, wait a minute. That's not what your job is, right? Yeah. Your job is to ask what their name is and who you're here to see. But they're looking at you and saying, "What are you here for?" That's what an assertive person would do. A person who's not assertive would say, "How can I help you? Are you here to see somebody today?" So you want to try to think about your job and say, what degree of assertiveness do we need to do that job? And the same thing would apply to all these other dimensions as well. Do we need somebody in the receptionist position to be impatient? So what are you here for and how long are you going to be? Well, I don't know how long I'm going to be, but I'm here to see Mark, right? So right away you put that person on tilt. Yep. Because you've been impatient with them and too assertive with them. And now that whole stage is set in a very different fashion for how you're going to have a conversation with the important person that you're there to meet. So it's important for organizations to think about their jobs just practically like that, and then to get that translated into some combination and degree of characteristics so that when they're looking at people as candidates, they can say, will that person have enough assertiveness or too much?
Good. I love how you're bringing this back, because my first question was kind of, how is this practical for organizations? And I got us a little off track on the 7 traits, but you're bringing us back as we go through the traits. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Wayne.
And so that combination of characteristics needs to show up in any job. There's no job in the world that doesn't have some requirement for detail. There's no job in the world that doesn't have some requirement for analytical or people-oriented focus on it. So every job in the world requires those 7 characteristics, some degree of them, in order for that job to be done well. And so the idea then is to try to determine the amount necessary based on your job description, and then measure that in the candidates that are interested, either internal or external, for that job. And the idea is not to get perfection where we want, everything to match 100%. But you can have people that match 80% and 70% and will nail it out of the park every day because they have some skills and experience or education that may compensate for some of the difference in traits they may have on a certain scale or two. So the idea is not to have perfection here. It's trying to find people who will naturally think like the job needs them to think every day.
Okay. The practical application, I think about this right now, hiring would be phenomenal. Thinking about promotions or where to promote people. I think about org design. I think about these situations where this tool is probably phenomenal for organizations. What would you add or take away from that?
I would agree. I would agree with all those things. I think this idea of succession planning is something that organizations are either uncomfortable with or not effective at doing. And you need to almost build to a large size before that idea of succession planning becomes something that is done at the beginning of a recruitment for any job rather than just when you're talking about an executive team. So I think that's an area that needs a lot more kind of emphasis and intentional practice by organizations around thinking about that. In a way, I'm kind of a benefactor of the succession planning that Howard Dutton did to me in my life as a very young engineer and a very young business person. When he saw something in me that he said, okay, this guy's an engineer and he seems to be smart, But there's something else that he has as well that I think can be really valuable, maybe more valuable than engineering that he does. And he saw that in me, and he started to already plan a kind of a trajectory for me in the organization, and in fact put me into that, and then saw the results of that actually worked well for the company, for me, for him. So organizations need to be more intentional about that. When we hire somebody, are we thinking further down the road about where could that person go because of how they're wired? And then how do we more intentionally start to make a path for them to accomplish that as time goes on? So I think that's a good place for us to be using it. I think another area is just leadership development. It's understanding that that leaders have different characteristics, and so when we find people with those characteristics, but they're not leaders today, what do we do to make sure that we don't lose those people? And so there has to be something that somebody is responsible for to make sure that we're developing that person, giving them the challenge and the opportunity to fail, but to also learn, and then test them and see whether or not they can actually perform at a level with some degree of competency, and then see whether or not that competency increases as they move more into behaviors that they are every day, as opposed to behaviors they aren't every day. I have an engineering education, but I was not an engineer. And it's sort of important to understand that about yourself, and for bosses to understand that about other people they're working for them. And education is one thing, but are you really an engineer, or are you really a leader and a manager with an engineering education? And trying to separate those two things so you can more effectively help that person and help your organization.
Which would help with retention on a completely different level. Because
well.
if we're hiring somebody who's geared to be that manager and wired to be that manager, these are their traits, and we then put them in an entry-level position, even if our plan isn't to keep them there forever, if we're not communicating that with this individual, if we're not allowing them to say, hey, listen, this is probably not going to be an ideal fit. Mm-hmm. But you know what? Put in your hours, learn the foundation of skills or that broad database of knowledge that you need, and this is going somewhere. Trust me. Mm-hmm. I know that if I was told that at certain times, I would have stuck it out way longer in certain organizations. But I just saw no future. I had no hope for this would fit me at any time, and so obviously I'm gonna leave at some point.
Can we take a little break for a moment?
Yeah.
I want to ask a question about something. I'm out of water. That's one thing. But thank you, Laura. I just thought of something that I did 20 years ago here at Concord. Something you said just brought this to memory here. So let me just get my whistle ready for wet here. Is this something that you want to record or just forget about? And I'm not going to be distracted if you say forget about it.
Yeah.
Along this idea of succession planning. So we had 3 clients: Weyerhaeuser, they're the biggest forest products company in the world, I think now; Shell, who you know; and Husky, who you know. So they were 3 clients of ours 20 years ago, and we were doing lots of traits work with them and teaching a variety of people in their organizations to use our instruments. Shell, at the time, asked if we would help them to do a succession planning project by incorporating our technology into that. And they were strategically building that for their Canadian business unit, which is quite large, like tens of thousands of people. But it was just their Canadian business unit. So I said, what are you thinking about? And so they said, well, we want to, every year we hire 40 to 50 engineers every year. So we go to all the universities that have mechanical and petrochemical courses, and we send our recruiters over there, and we try to hire 40 or 50 of the best engineers that we could find, and we bring them into our business, and we start to work them through our business and try to get them ready for leadership in some fashion or another. Nobody, other than the CFO, nobody in the Shell leadership team in Canada, everybody was an engineer, right? And the CFO may have even had an undergrad in engineering. I don't remember, but everybody. So they're an engineering enterprise, right? That's what their business is all about. And so I said, yeah, we can do that. We can help you to actually do that quite well at different kinds of levels. So I said, how about this idea? So we can take a design engineer. They call them process engineers. So process engineer would be the first job that a graduate engineer would be put into in a plant or a processing plant or at a drilling site or some facility that they may have a gas plant or something. So process engineer, and then there would be an engineering supervisor that would have a team of those people, and then there would be an engineering manager. No, sorry, no, a process engineer, and then a project manager, and then a plant manager, and then a regional manager, and they all with plants underneath them. So those 4 levels, right? So that was what they were trying to do. They weren't looking for vice presidents. They were looking for people who could be regional managers, because the whole country was divided into regions, and they wanted some person at the top that knew all of the stuff that was going on. So Alberta, for instance, had 2 regional managers, one in the north, one in the south. So there's not lots of them. So they're an important role in the organization. And I said, yeah, we could help you with that. We could help you in a variety of ways. But here's what we need to do that. And so I explained that we wanted to profile all of those 40 or 50 engineers they hired. And then we wanted to go and talk to people who were doing the process engineer job now, not the newbies, but the ones who were doing it now and had been doing it for 3 or more years. And then take their profile and also understand the job from them. Then we want to go up and talk to the project managers that the process engineers reported to. And again, they had to be there for 3 or more years. And we would take their profiles and talk about their job and start to see the differences between those 3 levels. And then we did the same thing with the regional manager. Regional manager there was maybe 25 or 30 in Canada at that point, I think.
Okay.
I said to them that this is actually a useful research project for our company, for what we do, for our technology and our consulting work. Would you allow me to bring 2 other clients that are using our technology? One of them is a quasi-competitor, Husky, and the other one's Weyerhaeuser, not a competitor at all. And would you mind if we did the same, if I could persuade them, would you mind if we did the same thing and just made this one kind of a large study, and I'll share the results with all of you so that you can all, not see your individual, you'll only see your results, but I'll amalgamate all the rest into sort of those core roles. And they said, sure, okay. And I said, I'll charge you less because we're going to get some research benefit out of this, and they'll share some of the costs on it. And so I persuaded Weyerhaeuser and Husky to do the same thing. And so I did this project for 3 months, going around talking to people and capturing all their profiles. And I came back to them at the end of that, and I said, so your idea of succession planning won't work as you described it to me. And they said, well, it's been working for 20 years now, DeWayne. I said, I know, but let me show you something that I discovered and uncovered in this process, that as you move from the process engineer to the project manager to the, process manager to project manager to plant manager to regional manager, that job is quite a bit different in the top 2 than it is in the bottom 2. And so what you've done is promoted people into the 3rd and 4th level that are kind of a little bit over their head. And a few of them you've done right. They actually are the right people. And my sense is that when I tell you their names, you're going to say, yeah, those are our best performers. And when I tell you these names, you're going to say, yeah, they need a lot of coaching and hand-holding. And now we know the reason for it, because they're hardwired in a very different way. So you can't do what you want to do. You can't just hire somebody and put them into this job and move them all the way up to the top, because those jobs change. And here's the evidence of that now. Yeah. And so at the end of that process, they said, okay, so now that that's done, established, and believed, they sent out their recruiters the following year, and they said to them, listen, we want you to hire 15 people with this profile and 10 people with this profile, right? So they got really focused on the people they wanted to hire, because they understood that we can't just make this happen because they have enough engineering experience and working in our business. So that was, and Weyerhaeuser and Husky had the same exact, I knew it was going to be that way. And it proved out to be that way. And so they all now started following that same process. Anyways, it's too long a story, but
Did you record it?
We have been recording.
So they recorded it. Keep it, okay? I like that story.
Okay.
And I know you can use it in a bunch of different ways, right? Yeah, I really like that story. I'm trying to think of how. So right now, where my mind is going, again, we're going up against time here, but I want to finish off these two ideas that I've asked, and I mixed them up, DeWayne. I'm sorry, but I want to figure out how to finish off you describing the 7 constructs. I also want to have you describe other ways that traits is a big benefit to organizations, that biggest bang for your buck idea that I interrupted you in and went off on a tangent. So where do you think we should start with that?
How much more do you want me to talk about the 7 traits then? Like,
I want it to be brief. I want it to be a summary. What I'm going to do is encourage people to sign up for an ability to go through a traits assessment with somebody. So
Okay.
that's where I'm kind of just teasing that out. For the biggest bang for buck, yeah, it's a different purpose. I think we can go into that a little bit more.
yeah, okay. So I finished off on detail orientation, I think. Did I
Yeah.
talk about that
Yeah,
one?
I don't know how much did you go through. You didn't talk about the social construct very much.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of, and patience we didn't go through very much either. Yeah, you might have. Oh, you know what? So you went through assertiveness fairly well, I think. Maybe talk about the other 3, and then we'll go to the bottom 3 as well.
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah. So sociability then, my need for interactions with people, my need to influence other people. So we all have some need for sociability. Some people have very little need, so they're quite comfortable to do lots of work on their own, go fishing by themselves, do lots of reading on their own and study on their own. People who have a higher level of sociability will always want to have some kind of a people component, conversation component, relationship component in what they're doing every day. And if you take someone who is highly relational and highly people focused and you put them into a job where they have to work on tasks every day, pretty soon it'll become painful for them, and they'll either get demotivated or they'll start to make mistakes because they can't focus on tasks properly and correctly for a long period of time. And every job has some combination of those. The sales jobs are easy, and even maybe some of the human resources jobs are easy to say, well, that should be more people-focused kind of work. But should management be people-focused? And you say, that's a good question. Does a production manager need to be people-focused? Maybe not. But they absolutely need to be able to be goal-focused and make sure other people are following and meeting those goals, and they're giving them feedback when they aren't. Does a sales manager need to be people-focused? Absolutely, because that sales manager will always have some kind of matter to deal with their staff with and say, you could have done this different, or why didn't you do this, or how did that relationship go sideways? What happened? What did they do? What did you do? What did you not do that made that relationship go sideways? Because now that client is at risk, or that customer is at risk in some fashion. So sociability is a really important part of every work job, or every job in the world, rather. And so it's understanding, what do we need? The challenge with sociability is that if you have an interview with someone who is more reserved, more quiet, and you have an interview with someone who's more outgoing, more sociable, more talkative, which one of those interviews is going to go better? And the way that most people will answer that question is going to be based on how easy it was for them to conduct that interview. And if you think about an interview with someone who is more reserved, that person's going to be more analytical and more brief in how they respond to things. So you're going to say, okay, John, so can you tell me about, how you would handle this kind of a situation? John thinks for a moment, and then he says, well, no. And you say, and you think, okay. And you're waiting for more, but he's finished. And now he's looking at you and saying, what's the next question in his mind? So then you get back to what's your next question? And so you go through that process for 20 minutes and you realize I've set aside an hour for the interview. We'll be finished in 15 minutes. I got another half an hour because this person is very succinct and brief and to the point, but they're not talkative. So all I'm getting is the answer to my question and nothing more, and in as few words as possible. So I, as an interviewer, are now working really hard to try to get this person to talk to me, but they don't do that naturally. They're just trying to be succinct and clear and specific and not say too many words. Then the person comes in who is very sociable for the same job, and I ask that person a question, and 5 minutes later I say, you know what, I do have a couple more questions because that person's still talking, right? And so I have to interrupt them now and say, can I ask a question now so I can get you in a different topic and content? You walk away from that interview saying, oh, that was fun, that was easy for me, that one was hard. Must be hard to work with that person. And there's that judgment that comes in, right? And judgment is an important part of how we do work. And judgment is a really valuable attribute to have. It's not a trait. And there is no scales that measure judgment. What we notice most about judgment is the absence of it. And so now when we have HR people that are making a judgment based on how they feel about their experience with that interview, and they're saying must be hard to work with that person because they're so quiet, that person is now being put in a penalty box effectively for that role, when maybe it's an engineering job and we don't want them to be talkative. We want them to be doing DX over DY most of the day, every day. But I fell into the trap of seeing this person who was so,
Fun.
easy to talk with, fun, entertaining, interesting, smiley faced, and had lots of answer for my question. That was easy for me. Must be easy to work with this person, right? So you fall into that kind of a mindset. Pace and patience is somewhat similar, I think. If you think about the jobs that are in the world today, like you can pick almost any kind of a scientific research job, and they're all going to be patient jobs. Doesn't matter whether it's for crafting the new atomic bombs that might show up in the world, or getting a man on the moon, or some kind of brain scanning technology that would allow you to see inside a person's brain without having to do an operation on it. Almost all of those jobs are very patient jobs, in the sense that they have a great deal of process that's a part of them. So you have to go through a certain series of steps, probably in a certain fashion, in a certain period of time, in order to come up with some kind of an outcome or conclusion or answer, if that's what you're looking for. So you can see most engineering jobs are the same way. So you start at the foundation and you work your way to the first floor, second floor, third floor. So many jobs in the world require a very methodical, process-oriented approach to do them properly. Every accounting job, except CFOs probably, are that way as well. So there's many jobs in the world that require a great deal of consistent, methodical, process-oriented kind of activities. There are some jobs, like a sales job, not to just focus on that one all the time, but management would be the same, where every day things are going to change. I'm going to have a different conversation with a different person about a different problem, about a different product, about a different service. Or as a manager, I'm going to talk to Mark today about this, and I'm going to talk to Laura tomorrow about that, or I'm going to deal with this with Laura, and I'm going to deal with this with Mark. And so every day is going to be different as a consequence of that. So I better be able to change speeds quite quickly without blowing gaskets in the process of doing that. So it's looking at jobs and trying to understand, is this a multitasking job, or is this a very process-oriented, methodical kind of approach job?
Routined expectation is the same every day.
Yeah. And detail orientation is probably one of the more important dimensions of a job, because sooner or later, every job requires detail orientation, sooner or later, right? So even salespeople have to fill in a form documenting what they did, or the components of the sale, or recording the order in some fashion, or submitting their expense report, whatever it may be. So every job has detail orientation at some point that they have to do. So you can't say that there are jobs that don't have detail. Every job does, but some require it every day. So you have, maybe a scheduler who's working in a plant and they have multiple projects that are going through that are being fabricated or manufactured or organized or assembled. And that scheduler sits in an office and every day they're looking at all the materials that are coming in and all of the orders that have to go out, and they're trying to get things all organized so that they go through the right place and the right station at the right time with the right quantity. Does that person need to be 100% accurate 100% of the time? No, because sometimes the truck doesn't show up with the raw material until an hour later, and so his schedule is now shuffled and he has to kind of recalibrate and make that work. And so, but 90% of the time or 80% of the time, we want that scheduler to be pretty close and pretty accurate and making sure that we're following that. Otherwise, we'll never get the orders out and we'll never be able to meet our customers' needs.
Yep.
What about a brain surgeon? If you were going in for brain surgery, would you want a brain surgeon to be average in detail orientation? No, you're probably thinking about that person. I want that person to be maybe 3 decimal places accurate in what they're doing in my brain when they're in there, because I won't know what they're doing and I won't see it. But I want 3 decimal places accuracy. If he slips or she slips just a little bit and cuts a wire in the wrong place, I could have a problem for the rest of my life. I don't want 80%. I want 3 decimal place accuracy in what they're doing. So it's understanding the degree, the importance, and the severity of those things and making sure that you're capturing that in the role that you want for someone. And then that person, that brain surgeon, better be pretty close to that. Otherwise, there's going to be some serious problems in the world for their patients and for them in the hospital probably. Behavioral adaptability is the 5th trait that we measure, and it's a kind of an obscure trait. It's kind of like when I meet somebody, when I'm interviewing somebody, when I'm just thinking about somebody that I know that I'm not interviewing, and I'm trying to think about, okay, what is that person's behavioral adaptability? I don't even know what that means. Like, how does that show up? What do I look for? Is it how fast they walk? Is it how quickly they can change their shirt? What is that, right? In terms of its expression in our human conduct. And behavioral adaptability, probably in its kind of easiest to understand form, I think, is this idea of personality elasticity. So how easy is it for this person that I'm speaking to or spending time with to behave differently? Can they be quiet for a period of time while I'm telling a story? Or do they need to interrupt me every 1 or 2 minutes because they have something they want to say and so they can't restrain themselves? They have to get it out there. So that person would have lower adaptability. They can't manage themselves to be quiet for a period of time to let the story or the conversation unfold. And so are there some jobs where you don't need a lot of behavioral adaptability? Yeah. So if I pick, accounting and without being, negative about it whatsoever, because I love accounting people and work, debits are on the left and credits are on the right all the time. And so, don't debate me with that. Don't argue with me about that. Debits are always on the left, credits are always on the right. And I'm always going to do that. Don't ask me to do it the other way around, just so I can show off and show you that I'm adaptable. No, they're always going to be this way. And we need that work to be done that way every day as well. We don't want them to be showing off that they can move the items from one column to another.
There's a purpose to doing it the same way every time and not adapting.
Yeah.
Creates efficiency.
Yes. And similarly with a manager. So a manager who has a variety of people that are reporting to them, they're not all going to have the same personality, the same age, the same everything. So they have to find a way to be able to talk to that person, as you were talking about earlier today, with this kind of a tone and this kind of a content, and this person in a different way, right? I'm going to take a break.
Yeah, okay.
Emotional control. It's a 6th trait that we measure. And most instruments in the marketplace don't measure that characteristic. In fact, there are in the last 15 years, a plethora now of instruments that are measuring emotional intelligence. And there are some really good books on that, and continued writing on it, and even some very focused training on helping managers, especially, to become more emotionally intelligent. But the root of that emotional intelligence is in the emotional control characteristic. That's the root of it. Not only that, but that's the root of it. And that's the characteristic that helps us to to either have a more sensitive feeling approach to how we deal with people and matters versus a more logical and rational approach, less sensitive perhaps at times. And so emotional intelligence, the root of it is that side of the scale that has a natural warmth, a natural sensitivity, a natural feelings orientation to it. Because that side of the characteristic is also where intuitiveness comes from. So people who have a lower degree of that characteristic, or I guess if you want to express it differently, a higher degree of emotiveness. But people who have that characteristic have a sensitivity and a feelings orientation in dealing with other people. So it's kind of like they can feel your feelings, they can be sensitive to your situation, issue, problem, joy. And so that helps them to be more intimate, more personal, and more responsive to how they're dealing with not just the content, but the emotiveness or the emotional content of something, or the absence of it for that matter. So, so it's an important characteristic in how people experience us. So you can be called very warm, wear your heart on your sleeve, or you can be called, very cool and clinical in how you approach things. And cool and clinical is not bad. I think if I was thinking about that brain surgeon, would I want one who is warm and fuzzy, or I want one who is cold and clinical, and I'm going for the cold and clinical every time? Because I don't want him to be listening to one of the nurses talking about a problem she had with her dog, and then he goes, oops, in my brain, because he's feeling some pain when he heard about the story of the dog that wasn't behaving properly this morning. So I want that person to be able to separate themselves from all of that and just focus on the task and make sure that they're very deliberate and focused on what they're doing. The last trait we measure is creativity. Creativity is something that is often visible when you meet people, because people who are high on the creativity scale often dress in a different way. They wear louder colored glasses, or they have larger mustaches, or 3 different colors of hair, perhaps, different physical ways that you can see creativity showing up in people who are very high on that characteristic. And people who are lower on that characteristic, they're going to be the ones that wear the blue suit and the white shirt pretty much all the time wherever they go, because that's easy for them and it's also well accepted in our society. So is creativity important? Not in a lot of jobs. What's more important? Innovativeness. Innovativeness is way more important in many jobs, in many organizations, than creativity is. Because innovativeness is the ability to take something that exists right now, either within your organization or outside, and taking that and finding ways to tweak or change or resize what you're doing or what you're producing to make it work better or fit a different need or do it in a faster, higher quality fashion of some kind. So innovativeness is way more valuable in the world in almost every business today than creativity is. But we need somebody to discover AI. Someone has to come up with that idea. Now that someone has come up with that idea, we see all of these manifestations out there of different ways in which it's expressed within our society. Most of the manifestations are innovative, but the person who came up with AI, or the people who came up with AI, that was creative. And now we're going to see all the variations and maybe even have some customized ones for our business or our industry at some point in terms of how AI can be utilized to solve problems for us or do things in a different, better way.
Another way that I've heard creativity spoken is how curious we are. And I remember getting kicked out of a lot of classes in school simply because I was curious. My teachers saw it as disruptive. For me, it was curious. And then that, to me, almost brings out the last thing that I want to bring out with all these traits before you take off here, DeWayne, and that is there's no good or bad here. With my natural inquisitiveness, my natural desire to ask questions and learn and ask and think about new ideas, there's a lot of value to that in many different spheres. And it would be absolutely destructive in certain offices where I just need to do the work. Me questioning the work right now, again, coming back to the accountant analogy you gave of the ledger. and in debits and credits and different sides. If in that situation I'm questioning how everything needs to change and be better, that's actually taking away from an organization. So it doesn't mean that it's good or bad. There are places for all of these things, and I think in some ways, to wrap this up, or to summarize what we've been talking about in so many ways, again, it comes back to that job description or that job personality of what does this job require? Not what does this job title require in another organization. In this organization, what does this job require? And then find the person that fits that, because they are going to be fantastic for that. And probably not fantastic in many other ways, not good or bad. What is the fit here? The one question I want to ask you to wrap things up here is, and this is something that I value greatly about the traits tool, is, okay, so we've got 7 dots on a page. Great. We've got different areas or placement on the continuum or scale. And something I appreciate is how we start to see this really unique picture of somebody when you start looking at the different dots put together. So assertiveness on its own says something, or timidity on its own says something. But when you put that dot along with somebody who is very social or very task focused, now you get a very different picture. Maybe use that example of those 2 traits, but talk about how when we start to see these traits together, it starts to show so much more a full picture of who somebody is and how they are going to interact with others.
Yeah. So there's a self-awareness part of this, that when you're first introduced to a traits assessment and you're looking at your results and you're looking at the wording, and then you're reading the graphical components you're talking about. The self-awareness is helping a person to understand that our characteristics are always balanced. Our 4 primary characteristics, assertiveness, sociability, pace, and detail, are always balanced around a kind of a fulcrum, a center of gravity, an engineer would call it. So that means that the distance that your trait, the strength of your trait on our scale, the further it sticks out from your center of gravity, your fulcrum, if you will, the stronger that trait is. What does that mean? Well, it means that it drives your thinking more. What does that mean? Well, it means that when you're thinking about something or behaving, that trait that sticks out the furthest is going to be the one that people will hear, feel, experience, usually first. So if you have, for instance, in your traits, sociability as your strongest trait, of all of those 4 or 7 even, it sticks out the furthest. That means it's kind of like the first thing that people experience. Here's my sociability. It's sticking out in front of me. And what is the first thing that you see when you touch me or when you come close to me? You feel my sociability. And that's kind of the physical expression of the trait graphs. It's helping people to understand this is how people will experience you. This is how you come across to people, because that trait is so strong and stronger than any other you have. Whenever you ask somebody about, tell me about Mark. Oh yeah, Mark, he's a fun guy. He's got 1,000 jokes and likes to show up for all the, you can see the sociability, the high degree of sociability. What about John? Well, John's very reserved. He pretty much only speaks when spoken to, but with a few people he's very talkative with, but they're close, excuse me, people that he's close to. So what do you see? Well, if you're in a event where there's a variety of people and you're having some food and you're having some drink and you're having some visiting and conversation, he's the guy that's kind of listening to most of the conversation and every now and then may smile about something, but seldom will say, hey, let me tell you about something. They're going to kind of sit there quiet for the evening, enjoy themselves and enjoy everybody else, but they don't feel this need to want to be, talkative about something. So it's kind of understanding, okay, good. I can go to that event, that company event or that corporate event, and I can be quiet because I don't need to show up, even though all these extroverted people are doing that. I don't need to do that. And if I do it, it'll probably look phony. So I'm just going to probably just be myself and smile and every now and then say some kind of thing that would acknowledge that I enjoyed something or that was funny or whatever. And I'm going to go home and I'm going to be okay with that. I don't feel this need to be outgoing and talkative and sociable about it. So it's understanding yourself. And the graph gives you that clarity better than the words do by themselves. So when you read the graph, you can say, oh, so that's why that trait sticks out so far. It's because I'm more quiet and I'm more reserved and I think more about stuff. Okay, now I understand that. And so that's why when all the salespeople come to me, none of them ask me out for lunch. Okay, now I understand that. And by the way, I'm quite happy with that too. So now that gives me clarity about something about me that I didn't understand. I knew I was quiet, but I didn't know I was that quiet. And now I have a context for myself in a different way than anyone has ever explained to me before. So it's very clarifying from a personal point of view. If you're interviewing someone and you know that before you meet them and you've never met them before, all you have is their resume and their profile, you can expect that this interview is going to not have a long, if you're booking an hour, you could be finished in half an hour. So if I know that, I'm going to bring a whole bunch more questions to that interview because I know that that's what's going to happen. So I can be prepared with more things that would be analytical and technical because that's what that person naturally does. So I'll get a chance to probe that, see the depth, see the clarity and the ingenuity maybe in that analytical thinking process.
And then coming, so it's, I mean, self-awareness being a huge part. I think about self-awareness and how as I get to know myself, it gives me freedom to be who I am and to explore how good I can be at who I am in an organization or with family, however it shows up. What about, again, just talk about the ipsative side of things, where you've got maybe sociability is higher than assertiveness, or assertiveness is higher than sociability, and some things that might show up in individuals as you start to put a couple of dots together or more dots together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you think about a management job, a middle and above management job within an organization, pretty much all of those jobs, regardless of the industry, is going to have the requirement for a higher degree of assertiveness, because at that level, you will have certain goals given to you by the leadership, or if you are a part of the leadership, you will have formulated and agreed upon certain business goals that have to be accomplished within some time frame. And so you are now thinking about the accomplishment of those goals. And now I have my team of people of which I'm responsible for this portion of those goals that I have to make sure is organized and accountable for achieving those things. So every day I'm thinking about, okay, how am I moving the needle forward in the accomplishment of those goals that I'm responsible for now? So that assertiveness is the trait that you use to have that daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it may be for your business, accountability conversation with your team members and saying, okay, how are you doing on this? Did you get those things done? What's your schedule for this? And so it's bringing those accountability questions regularly in front of people to make sure that they know they have to get something done. You know they have to get something done, and we're keeping each other engaged in that process of accountability. It's not just one; it's two people. So you need that. If that job also requires a higher degree of sociability, because you spend a good part of your day dealing with people inside or outside of the organization. So it's kind of like when I try to help people understand, what's the degree of sociability that a job should have, I say, well, just think about maybe a typical day, or if it's better, a typical week in this job. And in a typical day or in a typical week, does this job spend more than 50% of its time dealing with people inside or outside the organization, on the phone, across the table, in meetings? Does it, and they say, oh yeah, no, more than 50%. Does it spend more than 75% of its time dealing with people every day? And if it's a sales manager, they'll say, yes, more than 75%. They're dealing with people inside, outside the organization every day. So that's a very high degree of sociability required for that job. If you say it's a production facility, a production plant, and you ask about that job, and that person says, well, no, they've got a group of people that are working out in the plant every day. They're doing their stuff, and they have to have a meeting in the morning where they're talking about things that have to change because this material didn't come or the schedule is behind. So they have an organization meeting, a priority meeting in the morning, and then the manager goes back to his or her office, and the staff go out and start doing the stuff, and the manager may come back out, at lunchtime or at morning coffee break and just take a visual look at it, have a couple questions, and go back to their office, record the progress and answer emails and get the next material order out for the next shipment, blah, blah, blah. So you say, yeah, no, that person doesn't spend 50% of their time dealing with people every day. It's less than 50%. So why would we want to hire someone who is very sociable? Because they're going to be out in the plant talking to these people every day, probably interrupting the production because they need to go and talk to people, but the job doesn't need that. They need them to talk some with people, but not so much every day. So it's getting that kind of clarity about the degree of this that's necessary so that you can make sure you don't fall into the trap of being, attracted to someone who's higher on the sociability scale, easier to talk to, more fun to talk to, more interesting, and you're letting that prevail over someone who should be a production manager where we actually don't need that job to talk. Maybe only 25 or 30% a day is spent dealing with other people. So it's kind of getting those things clear for yourself and also for how you are evaluating other people for that kind of a role.
And again, thinking about the consequences of, hey, if we get this wrong in a certain way, who is going to show up for this role? That matches what we wanted or what we said we thought we wanted, but doesn't actually match the role that we need somebody for, right? Again, thinking about that person who's always around the water cooler rather than in their desk, because they're social. They need to get their words out every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This has been really helpful, DeWayne. I find that every time I'm with you, even if we have a similar conversation, I learn a lot, which I really appreciate. I know that it's going to be appreciated by listeners and viewers here as well. We're going to take a break here and come back for this because there are a few more episodes that we want to record and get done. And what we want to do for the next 3 episodes is really make this pragmatic, maybe make this practical for organizations so that they can say, oh, so I am here, I need these things, this is what's going to help me. And I think that we've done that now with traits. We're going to talk about that with other tools that are part of the consulting sphere or consulting toolbox.
Mm.
Welcome to episode 2 here. We're going to be jumping into traits. What is this tool? Where did it come from? What is the whole field of psychometric assessments? What is it about? What do we talk about in it? What difference does it make for an organization? Where is it useful in a bunch of different ways? And then specifically go through the 7 traits in the traits assessment and where those fit, what it starts to share about somebody. I think that if I was to give advice as to what to listen to most closely, it would be pay attention to what DeWayne says about job roles and how a job has a personality. Every job has a personality, and we've got to fit that job with what we need in an organization, not what we want, not who we like, but what the organization needs with an individual that fits that. And the better fit we get, the more efficiency, the more value we're going to receive from that fit in so many ways. DeWayne goes into many different subjects, gives a couple of really good stories as well. But again, pay attention to that because as I've been learning and growing myself, I've realized that if there's only one thing I need to get right or that I can get right and do a lot of other things not as well, it's to get that job fit, that job personality with the person. And if I can fit those extremely well, I end up getting far more than what I thought I was going to get in an individual, an employee. It makes such a big difference. Again, efficiency, the productivity goes through the roof compared to how I used to be doing things for myself and my own organization. Enjoy this episode and enjoy the stories, enjoy everything that we're going to be talking about. And we'll cover this a little bit more in a very different way in episodes 3, 4, and 5 coming up here.